This is Criteria.
Hello there. Well, I've eaten my crab cake, and I've eaten my chicken cutlet. I've drank my fine Belgian ale, and I've eaten my apple cider donut. I'm simmered and sozzled enough for a whole platoon, and I've just watched Thérèse for a second time. My name is Thomas Miras. Thank you for listening.
The thing is,
I'm here with my co-host, James Majewski.
The thing is that that's all true. Every word of it.
Are you going to say hello to the folks?
Hello,
at home?
folks. And hello, Thomas, in whom there is no guile. We're joined here by an estimable guest, so much so, in fact, that he is no longer a guest, but a guest co-host, I suppose, some sort of hybrid guest host and Canadian.
Making him sound like some kind of horror from the deep.
Well, he is also Canadian,
that
but we
only
won't hold that
science
against
has
him.
concocted.
Nathan, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. As a
His
Canadian,
last name is Douglas.
We're so used to being hybrids that it's all good, you know.
Yeah, that's a fair retort. Very clever.
So Nathan, as y'all know, probably is a filmmaker and a film commentator, and he just actually started. We mentioned this on our bonus episode about Walker Percy, but Nathan, you just started Substack, where you write about film, right?
I have a Substack where I write about film, and that is starting this summer. Yes, you can go check out the introductory posts on there. So
yeah, and there you can subscribe to it already if you want to get Nathan's film commentary in text form. It's at vocationofcinema.substack.com. What does COM stand for? Company?
Company.
I think so.
Okay,
Yeah.
good to know. All right, so...
But, being our resident Canadian, perhaps you can introduce the film that we're talking about today and correctly pronounce the director's name.
Oh, we're just going to punt it to him? I wanted to try.
Well, let's give Thomas a shot at it first.
Okay. This film from 1986, included on the Vatican film list under the category of religion, is Thérèse, directed by Alain Cavalier. Cavalier. Sounds more Spanish.
Cavalier!
Cavalier. Cavalier.
It's Alain Cavalier, actually.
Yeah. So, why does everything feel so quiet? I feel like there's just like a dead silence whenever we're not talking. Maybe it's the silence of self-consciousness. So, this is a really interesting film that I hadn't seen before. But Nathan, you had wanted to discuss this as a kind of intro to the genre of the saint film, or film, as they call it in Scotland. That's right. So. This is truly now a podcast.
There is a heat wave
now gotten,
in New York City, all right? And I think
we're sweating like bonanzas here.
Of like in the 90s.
Yes. And
Fahrenheit.
And
that's
we
Fahrenheit.
This is
Nathan.
now truly called a podcast. We have wasted enough time on the introduction that this is now a true film podcast. So now, we actually did watch a film about a saint before. We watched Pope John Paul II, but we discussed that more in terms of being a biopic. This is not a biopic, thanks be to heaven. And we are excited to talk about it because it's a very, very, very interesting and also slightly creepy film. Nathan, why did you pick this one rather than one of the other saint movies on the list to start with and kind of exemplify this genre?
Yeah, well, there's a few reasons for that. Some of them are personal and some of them are more related to kind of questions of which films are more interesting to kind of talk about to begin unpacking the question of what makes a good saint movie, whether we consider that as a genre or as something that poses kind of certain formal requirements. Just on the personal side, Saint Thérèse is my patron saint.
Nice.
And when I was converting to Catholicism, in 2012 to 2013, I picked up Story of a Soul at a Christian bookstore in my hometown, and kind of picked it up on a whim, just noticing it was one of the few Catholic books in a store that was run by a wonderful Protestant gentleman, and took it home, started reading it, and about halfway through my RCIA process, the question of who are you going to choose for your patron saint came up, and I was reading Story of a Soul at this time, and over the course of a couple months of reading that book, I switched from thinking that it was going to be St. John of the Cross as my patron saint, because he was kind of the first Catholic, kind of the first non-biblical Catholic figure that I had ever heard of. So I thought, hey, well, maybe he's the one to go with, and I changed to Saint Thérèse because her reading Story of a Soul during my formation in RCIA was just very profound and moving, and I was also 24 years old when I came into the church, and she was 24 when she died. So I saw, sort of nice little resonances like that. But yeah, long story short, we became good friends, and I had the pleasure and privilege of doing a pilgrimage, kind of a personal pilgrimage in 2016 while I was in France on sort of a business related trip. I was able to make a trip to Lisieux and spend a few days kind of retracing her steps, all of the major sites from Thérèse's life, spend time praying at her tomb at the monastery. And that was a profound experience as well. So yeah, I mean, if there's going to be a list of saint films to look at and Saint Thérèse is one of them, then that's kind of the first one I'm going to go for those reasons. Yeah. But one other thing I'll just say is that I had seen the film before, and I also knew it's a film of many kind of intersections in the sense that it's a secular film. It was a big deal in France when it came out. It's also a very formally, and I'm sure we'll unpack this as we go on, but it's a film that is taking a very unconventional, formal approach to how to telling the story of Saint Thérèse. And so it's doing all sorts of really interesting things on the filmmaking side that are absolutely worth talking about.
Yeah. By the way, I just want to note that I was unexpectedly blessed with a relic of Saint Thérèse today. After Mass, I went to Holy Innocents, and I think, certain churches, they do like a different set of kind of novenas on different days of the week after Mass. And there were a bunch of different prayers, but one of them was a prayer to Saint Thérèse, I think, and he blessed us kind of not on Mass, with a relic. So I was like, oh, sweet.
That's perfect. Amazing. And that's not the first time that I've heard a story like that.
Well, this is like par for the course with Saint Thérèse.
Right. I feel like she is always unexpectedly like blessing people with her relics. I've heard numerous stories like this. Yeah. So I
wish I had worn my Dusk Whales Saint Thérèse t-shirt now that I think of it.
Sure.
Dusk Whales did our theme song for Criteria, and Saint Thérèse is on one of their album covers.
Well, they were unexpectedly blessed by a relic of Saint Thérèse.
Yeah, they tell
evening.
that story on their interview on my podcast.
Yeah. Wow, very cool. Very cool.
Yeah, yes, thank you, Saint Thérèse. Yes.
I need to find out where this is happening, because I maybe this is like a New York thing. You unexpectedly get blessed by Saint Thérèse everywhere, and I'm like,
well, my wife's patron saint is also Saint Thérèse. When she was being brought into the church 2 years ago, she also picked up Story of a Soul, and she watched this film actually at the time. I remember her telling me about it. I didn't watch it. I had never seen it before getting ready for this episode. It does a really great job of capturing the spirit of Thérèse, especially the performance from the lead actress. But yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get to all of that.
Yeah, and as far as that's concerned, I'll be depending on both of you, because I've never read Story of a Soul, so my knowledge of Saint Thérèse is really just from people telling stories and learning about her in elementary school. And
I read Story of a Soul many years ago.
If you want Thomas to read Story of a Soul, please tell us in the comments down below.
Okay, should we start with the formal qualities, or should we start with Catherine Mouchet's performance?
I think we should talk about what the film's approach first, and then go into the performance, just because what really sets the film apart is how it is approaching her life.
Yeah, and that's apparent immediately from the beginning. Not that the excellence of this woman's performance isn't apparent from the beginning either, but I think right away, my favorite parts of the film are probably the first 10 minutes. Because you grow so accustomed to watching films that handle exposition in like a really clumsy way or in a really sort of drawn out way. Maybe there's like issues of pacing. I feel like those opening moments of any film present a unique challenge against anything else that happens later on.
Right.
And that the first several minutes of this film are absolutely captivating. And a big part of that is the very stylized way in which these opening scenes are rendered. I'll probably hand most of this over to you, Nathan, as the filmmaker here, but a few observations that I'll make right off the bat is that it's almost like a kind of montage way of editing. They're very short snippets of interactions or gestures, interspersed with often a whole fade out and fade back in, sometimes even within the same scene.
Right.
So
it's like if you could have a montage of one
conversation. Yeah. So it's really quite fascinating. There's kind of this staccato sort of rhythm to it, and also a intense kind of I don't know how to put it, like focus on one single action or one single gesture.
Yeah, there's a focus, but there's also a like out of time quality to it. Like these are like, I feel like we've talked about this on the podcast before in relation to some movie, or maybe not, or maybe I just read about it with relation to some movie, but I forget what, but there's this quality in this film of like the moments are given like a greater significance
Andrei
than
Rublev.
the amount of... Okay.
We talked about this when
did?
we had our conversation about Andrei Rublev
Yes.
with Nathan.
It's like the moments are given a greater significance than the like amount of time that they're given
Yes.
on screen by these like punctuations.
Yes.
And like there's also a leisurely quality, because you can call it staccato, but it has this like languorous quality to the slow fade.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Nathan.
Sure, yeah, and maybe if perhaps there's a clip that will show that might just give a quick emphasis on this,
Yeah,
but
we
just for
will,
those
we
who
will.
don't have the opportunity to see that, what we're describing is this film has a very kind of matter of fact approach to narrating certain events from the life of Saint Thérèse, and the way it does this, it has it's almost like I don't want to say like a newsreel, but it's basically like events are happening. These what we're describing as moments. These are moments that are mostly taken from passages in A Story of a Soul. So to someone who is familiar with the life of Saint Thérèse, most of these will be very familiar, but they're told without, the thing to note is that they're told without any real sense of drama. There isn't kind of it's not a dramatic treatment. The whole of the film is not a dramatic treatment of the life of Thérèse. There are no conflicts per se. There are no obstacles to overcome. There isn't really the classic kind of 3 or 4 or 5 act structure to it. The film itself is really treating this as kind of one almost stream of consciousness, like kind of series of events from beginning to end. And that's definitely that is the most striking thing about it, is that it's really not trying to tell you a story. There isn't any kind of real sculpting of this as a narrative. It's a series of events that are just linked together, and then it ends. And
the kind of homogeneity of the setting contributes to that as well.
Yes, that is another really awesome part of this film, is that it looks like, well, this is how Thomas described it. It looks like it's all shot inside of like a 1990s like photo,
like
studio.
A family photo with like the sort of like very slightly textured background.
But it's awesome because you'll just have these like amazing sequences where you'll move from one room to another room, and it'll just be a camera pan from one portion of this lit studio to another lit portion of this same studio.
Right.
And it's sort of, again, I mentioned this sort of like intense focus of the way that it's edited. Well, there's also this kind of intense focus that comes from this stripping away of all of the extraneous parts of setting and place and objects, there's a real economy, not just in the way this story is related to us, but also in the way that it's dramatized and presented. We were watching this, and Thomas said this must have been the lowest budget film ever made, and it's not a bad thing. The result is something actually really cool that I can't say that I've seen before in film.
And you could say something about the theater, but it's really not a theatrical film,
right?
Yes, they do that on stage, on theater stages, where they have like different parts of the set lit and different things, but it's its own type of thing,
right? So there are plenty of films that you watch them and you think, I'm thinking in particular of some films from like the 40s and 50s where it's like, this is staged just like you would in a theater setting. In fact, we talked about this in our first episode with you, Nathan, when we talked about A Man for All Seasons. There's some films you watch them and you're like, this is basically indistinguishable from theater. They've just set up a camera to capture it all. And that's not what's going on here. Here, there's a tremendous sensitivity to the camera and to what the camera is capturing and to the angles at which things are being shot, and a lot of close-ups, and even
the whole thing is close-ups, basically.
Yeah, and even the interaction between the camera and the space is there's an acknowledgement of how this is different from theater. I'm thinking in particular of this one amazing moment when Thérèse she's just given her like initial profession, and she's being admitted into the cloister, and she moves from sort of the room where she's saying goodbye to her family and to her friends, and she passes through darkness with one of the sisters, and they're holding two candles, and all that the camera captures in this moment as they're passing through the darkness is the light from these candles, and then they emerge into the light of the cloister, and it's like that's amazing. That's something uniquely cinematic, but also sort of utilizing space in the way that theater might utilize it. So the result is something, like I said, very unique, very exciting, something I haven't seen in film before, and I think it is very effective given the subject matter. This attention to these moments in Thérèse's life,
and that there's no exteriors in the entire film. It's just about life in the cloister. You don't see any outside ever.
Right.
Yeah. And so those are that's James, you're hitting exactly on kind of, again, the reason why I picked this film as far as like talking about saint cinema, which is that this film is basically working against all of the kind of established conventions of not just popular cinema, but I would say most mainstream and art cinema, in the sense that the draw of cinema as an art of the real, is that you can go out and shoot things on location.
Right.
You can dramatize events that are happening in these locations that you could not possibly reproduce the effect of on stage. And so on the question of the kind of like the traditional theater versus cinema, battle, this has always been like an argument in favor of cinema as far as an art of the real, of trying to create an effect that is more visceral. And here's a film doing the opposite. It's taking us into a entirely theatrical space. It's this entirely abstract space where the background doesn't matter. We are only given the most bare kind of set decorations to tell us whether we're in the convent or we're in the Martin's home, or just the very rudimentary basics to tell that, okay, we are in a new space. And so it's kind of pushing back on this. And the thing is, though, as you said, James, it still remains 100% compelling and vital as a cinematic experience, losing the realism of shooting this on set, on stage, or excuse me, on location. We can think of any number of productions that would have maybe tried to shoot a Thérèse film on location in Lisieux, like in the real Le Buissonnette where she grew up, or in the real convent or whatever. And there's nothing wrong with that either. That's a wonderful idea, if that's possible. But to choose consciously to, no, we're going to focus on something else. And so the question then becomes, what is that something else? If the draw of cinema, if we could say like the thought of why make a film about a saint and then do it in this way, if the draw of creating a film to do that is to try to somehow get closer to the saint, get closer to who was this person, try to come, understand their essence in some way, then one strategy, and that's one that this director, Alain Cavalier, has chosen to do, is to do away with what seems to be extraneous, the questions of realism, really, and get into something else. The question kind of is, what is that something else? And does he succeed in getting there, so to speak?
So I've been reading this book by Jacques Maritain, Art and Scholasticism, and I'm going through it like very slowly. It's my first time reading it. And I recall him quoting a painter, I think it might have been Cezanne or something, saying that to the effect of saying, I want my paintings to look like paintings. And this I deeply sympathize with, because I feel similarly in theater. I want theatrical experiences not to like reach toward like being film live, or to try to, imitate life so precisely that it's like we're just like sitting in front of real life. I want my theater to look like theater. I want my painting to look like painting. I want my film to look like film. And this film definitely feels that way. It definitely looks like film, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It has like a fully fleshed out aesthetic concept, which serves the subject matter of the film, and is fully itself, and has like I would say like a complete integrity, whatever other flaws this film may have. I think that it is something that has like an integrity to it that can't be taken away.
I have to say, this is perhaps one of my favorite films that we've watched on the Vatican Film List so far.
Yeah, I'll say that this film touched me spiritually more than any of the other films that we've watched so far, and most of that was done in the early moments of the film, where we're seeing Thérèse's concern for this convict to be executed, and I found that so like challenging, right? Watching this film, I was like, okay, this is like everything that I don't have. Like my heart is like very shriveled, and hers is like totally open and like generous, so it was very challenging.
Well, Nathan, you mentioned you brought up the question of what is this film focusing on? If it's not this kind of attempt at realism by shooting on location and getting into the spaces where Thérèse, the real life Thérèse, lived and moved and breathed, what are we getting close to? And I think that here we have to begin talking about the performance of this actress who plays Thérèse, because I mean that's what is moving me so much at the beginning of this film. Everything else that's happening is in service to what I'm being shown in the face of this woman who's smiling as she's excitedly talking about the prayers and the penance that she's going to offer for this murderer. It's in fact, it's the same sort of spirit that seduced me when I first encountered Story of a Soul. When I first picked up Story of a Soul, this was many, many years ago. This was like 2008 or 2009. I picked it up thinking like, what is this? This is gonna be like some like girls stuff, forgive me, Thérèse, forgive me, our Lord and our Lady, but I totally had this kind of contemptuous attitude going into it, thinking like, well, this is not going to be any like St. Augustine or anything, but there's like this very disarming way where St. Thérèse can talk about the smallest thing and totally capture you. And I kind of felt similarly right off the bat with this film, and with the performance of this actress. What's her name? Catherine
Mouchet.
Yeah. Because
I've never seen. First of all, she has an amazing physical resemblance to
Yes.
the real Thérèse. But even more amazing is what she captures in the face and the eyes, like the joy, the peace, like the ecstasy that she conveys, that I really don't think I've seen in an actor. I don't think I've ever seen an actor convey the beatitude that you see in a face like, I mean, you could say Thérèse, but also, gosh, I can't remember the saint. It's like a young Italian saint of recent times, of like the 80s or something. This young woman who died young of cancer. Do you know what I'm talking about?
No.
I can't remember her name. Chiara Badano, Blessed Chiara Badano. If you ever seen photos of her lying in her sick bed, it's the same like glow, you know, and you see it especially also in female religious, you know, even more than you see in priests or male religious.
You think about the Nashville Dominican Sisters, or like the Sisters of Life.
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't think I've ever seen that conveyed in a film before. That joy, and also like the girlish quality that is filtered through is really amazing. And also I commented on one particular scene where she is talking to her mother superior. It's the first kind of private conversation they have, I think, where it's the scene where she tells her to write her diary, and she's kneeling there and very still. But I said to James, like, the whole like right side of the screen is just like emanating this trembling, like receptivity, and like this like eroticism, even though she's very still. And like, when I say eroticism, I don't mean that in like a sexual way. I mean that in like the broad sense of that word, of like I don't know how to define it.
Well, yeah,
actually,
like the Carmelite, the kind of the Carmelite Saint Teresa of Avila kind of.
Yes.
Yeah.
So even in a moment like that where she's not really doing anything, it's more her like, it's like this receptive quality, and like the way that she looks at people, the way that she takes things in, and like the way she's like leaning spiritually, like leaning to receive, you know, to hear, is really powerful. And I really don't know how that actress managed to do that.
Yeah, I think it's an absolutely remarkable performance, and maybe the way I'd want to tackle it is considering like the kind of challenges that it's up against in certain contexts. Like on the one hand, we have the kind of like the French Catholic context, where it's like Saint Thérèse is like arguably the most important Catholic saint in France since Joan of Arc. I think that's pretty easy to say. She completely defines modern Catholicism in France. And so there's this cultural and spiritual baggage that is attached to doing a film, and to an actress. For an actress to approach the role, you know, she must have known that she is, you know, taking on this challenge that's going to have to deal with all of this accumulated weight of assumptions and expectations that comes not only from two sides, from of course the believer side, from the Catholic side. And on the one hand, there are positive elements of that, but there are also, from an artistic standpoint, negative elements of that, especially with what we would consider what's kind of been called the Saint Sulpician style of art. In the West, or in English speaking cultures, we tend to call this plaster saint type stuff. It's that catch-all for the sentimental plaster saint statue culture that arose in the late 19th century. And Saint Thérèse is kind of one of the classic saints who really became spread around through this form of art.
She's like the perfect candidate for it in a sense.
Absolutely. And that's become kind of the stereotype. And you know, to this day, and especially today, anyone who is talking about Saint Thérèse in a public context, you'll always get that disclaimer, kind of, you're just doing it, James,
right?
Where it's, you know, oh, well, I was expecting this kind of very flower, you know, the little flower, the flowery, overly sentimental kind of thing. Everyone starts their discussion of Saint Thérèse with that disclaimer.
Yeah, that's very true.
And I mean, there's reasons for that, but I also find it curious that that it still happens. And so this film, I think, is definitely a direct response to the culture that to that kind of culture where, they're saying we're not going to approach this in the pious, not the pious tradition. Well, the film is not coming at it from a pious angle, I would say, but they're trying not to do it in the tradition of the pious, sentimental kind of stories that are common in like pious folklore of the time. They want to, strip that away and get to what is real underneath.
Yeah, well, and it's not that there's like some sort of like dark image of Thérèse in this film, right? Like she suffers with a smile on her face. She longs or she suffers desolation with a smile, or physical suffering with a smile. At the beginning, as her sister is pouring some water for her, after she's like just found out that the convict that she's been praying for kissed a crucifix before his death. She's like leaning toward the cup as it's being filled with water, and she's got this big smile on her face. And for a moment I thought like, oh no, this is going to be kind of like a cringy, overly sentimental portrayal, but not at all. And in fact, I shouldn't have even thought that at that point, because before, when she's talking to her sister about how she's going to pray for this man and she's going to save him before they slit his throat, she has this like, there's like this zeal in her eyes. It's this eroticism that you're talking about. There's like this vigor, and this excitement in the task of winning souls for Jesus that does not come across as affected or cheesy or fake. Mm-hmm. And this is who Thérèse is, right? I mean, this is the woman who promises that she's going to spend her life showering roses, upon
spend her
earth.
time in heaven. Yes.
Spend her eternal life, I should say.
There's an aspect, anyone who reads Story of a Soul, I think, is going to come across like where it's like and portrayals of her life. There's that aspect of this is too good to be true. It's like, could someone be so happy under suffering? And even I think this is something you kind of encounter even just if you casually are, someone in our age, if you're watching older films from the Hollywood era, the classic Hollywood era, especially when there's, a more of a happy-go-lucky kind of approach to performance in certain situations. And it's just like, it doesn't strike you as realistic. You're like, that's not what someone would do in that situation, or this person's too, something rings false about it. And there's that fear that with Saint Thérèse, there's that fear that will carry through to this as well. It's just not possible for somebody it's not possible for there to be a Saint Thérèse, who under the weight of so much suffering, or even in the modern age, like this doesn't happen. And yet it did happen. She was real. And I think what this film does well, and especially in regards to this performance, is that it presents kind of a case for, yes, this is what she may have been like, this is what she could have been like. And this is how it gives you a way to, by stripping away all that kind of excess stuff about like, oh, are we going to shoot this in an actual location, or are we going to try to dramatize this in some way? They're saying it's almost like the film is really just tackling this question of, is it possible that someone like this could have existed? If it is possible, then it's possible that an actor can actually perform that. And so I think the film is kind of taking on that challenge and saying, like, if we can actually perform this and do it in such a way that we've removed all of the other elements that might be affecting our emotions or our perception, then maybe we can get to the heart of like how this could possibly be a thing. I think the film is a fundamentally like secular film in this aspect. Like it's not really interested in Saint Thérèse as a supernatural figure. It's really more grappling with, I guess it is interested in a negative sense. It's grappling with, how could this be? And we're going to take aside everything else that might get in the way and try to just examine, how can this be? How can someone like this exist?
Well, if that makes it a secular film, then if a secular film is looking for the supernatural, then I don't know what it would mean to call it a secular film.
I want to qualify. I say secular in that, like, it's a film that came, from what I understand, it's from the French film establishment. It was certainly honored by the French film establishment. It won all the French Oscars for that year, pretty much, against some big competition. And so it's not a film that was, set in motion by the church or by even noted Catholic filmmakers, from what I understand. So, right.
Yeah. And yet I was going to say that, this film struck me as one of like the few, like, unambiguously, like, indisputably religious films that we've watched in the religion section of the Vatican film list so far. I mean, you could say that Andrei Rublev is kind of humanistic. You could say that, we could debate, is Babette's Feast really a religious film? I think it is, but and I think Andrei Rublev is, certainly makes it in the door as well. But this film is definitely interested in her mystical life. We can say that, we could say that that's like kind of the central subject of the film is her relationship with Christ. So in that sense, I think like that it's not a film that's just like, just about the human condition or something like that. It is dealing, from whatever perspective, it is dealing with it and taking it seriously and taking it as something real. And, we can talk about some of the other elements which might complicate the overall picture. But as far as Saint Thérèse herself is concerned, this film is clearly dealing with her in a very sincere and complete manner, I think.
Absolutely. Well, I definitely sincere. I don't know if I agree about complete.
Yeah, me neither.
Sincere. It's very sincere.
Because there's almost a sense that...
Well, you guys have read the book and I haven't. So.
There's almost this sense that the film is being shot from the outside, that it's like standing outside the gates looking in. Now, maybe this isn't true for the performer, right? Her performance indicates to me that there's a deep sense of living within this person, the scene in particular that's got me, just if I can go on a quick tangent on this, is right after she's given her first profession and she is saying goodbye to her friends and her family. The expression on her face is just so filled with joy, and it looks like she's been crying. She looks like a new bride, but
it's so real and like realistic.
Yes.
And like they got it exactly right. I've never been at a profession, but I've seen things like that, and the exact tenor of emotion that they got is pretty amazing.
So, I don't know how you do that as an actor without getting inside of Saint Thérèse and her heart, right? But from the film's perspective, from the filmmaker's perspective, there does seem to be like a kind of distance that's never closed between the camera and Thérèse.
Why do you say that? Can you give an illustration of that?
Well, I think that for me, it's probably most evident in the way that suffering is addressed in the film, and not just by Thérèse, but by others, and in particular the other young Carmelite who is kind of a foil to Thérèse, Lucy. There's almost, I hesitate to say it, but I feel like there's almost a conflation of willingness and desire to suffer with masochism, as if these things are indistinguishable, or they're the same sort of impulse, but in a different context. An analogy that I might use is if someone were to say, well, okay, like sex is fundamentally the same reality, but it takes place in a different context, whether it's in marriage or, in irregular circumstances, to take the language of Amoris Laetitia. You know what I mean? Is that, well, it's not the same. Right. Even if the context has changed, like the reality is different, and it's motivated by a different spirit. And so I almost felt, maybe we'll just cut all of this. I don't know, but
Let's keep going.
No, I think you're getting at something.
yeah, I almost felt as if the attempts by this film to understand, what leads a young woman to embrace suffering in such a radical way kind of fall short, and almost portray it as such that it's like, yeah, this is kind of just like a crazy masochistic person.
Well, we
but
get
this
the
is
like
happening in a-
eroticism that I mentioned in
Yeah.
Saint Therese, which is in like a very pure form, but then we get it in that other character in a very impure form.
Mhm.
And I would say that character, you described her as a foil. I would say that she, Sister Lucy, she is a contrast to the approach of Saint Therese. But then we also get this letter that Saint Therese receives from her sister Celine,
Yes.
which is this like describing this dream she had where she was like fantasizing about martyrdom, but it almost, like, I don't even want to say it, but
yeah, it's
but
in
like,
language
but like
that's kind of disconcerting.
yeah. Well, we get this language in John Donne's Holy Sonnets,
Sure.
but that's directed towards God. And in this case, it's like directed toward the person who's like directly causing her suffering, and
Yes.
it's just this. There's a weirdness to it. So there is some kind of ambiguity there, and I'm not really sure.
I
what
want
the
to just say
filmmaker's
that
doing.
in no way am I trivializing the mystery that is martyrdom, that is willingly taking on suffering for Christ,
and even desiring martyrdom. Or
yeah. I mean, you read some of these stories about the saints, and there's extreme stuff in there, and it is a real stumbling block. It's something that you really kind of have to grapple with. I don't know that this film totally succeeds in grappling with that aspect of the mystery of sanctity. Right?
On the other hand, I think that we do see it. I think that in Saint Therese, we don't see any of that stuff. And so I think that you can also possibly read it as showing different shades of this in either pure or impure, or maybe in the case of Celine, this letter from Celine, like mature or immature forms, because I think that in the history of probably especially female monastic mysticism, especially in the Middle Ages, you have some of these difficult questions of like, okay, is this a real vision that the person is having, or did they starve themselves to the point where they're having hallucinations? And this was a question that was not just a question posed by modern skeptics, but it was an awareness that Mother Superiors and spiritual directors had at the time. Saint Teresa of Avila, I'm told, even raises this as like, how do you determine when one of the people in your convent is having real mystical experiences, or when they're having wishful thinking while they've starved themselves into a stupor. So I think that the same can be said with desire for martyrdom. Origen talks about like how you shouldn't seek. I think it's Origen talks about how you shouldn't like actively seek martyrdom. Like that's spiritually immature.
Right.
And so I think that maybe you can see something. There is like I think that some of the eroticism in not the stuff with Thérèse, but some of these other characters, these other two characters, maybe some of it is a little bit, there's something a little dark about it or something a little troubling about it. But on the other hand, there is also this, I think there is a spectrum of like certain things that are like genuine desires, but also are like mixed with things that can impurify it or that like need to be matured. I think maybe we can see that with Celine. It's hard to tell exactly what the filmmaker is trying to say. In the case of Sister Lucy, it seems like she's a character. So she's this character. First of all, she seems to have like untoward feelings towards Thérèse. I think we can probably say that. She's about her age. Maybe you get the impression that she's one of these people who kind of like was taken into the convent off the street to like save them from, life in the cruel world. And not because they have like necessarily a religious vocation, or not because they are even like at the level that you would spiritually that you would normally expect to require someone to be, that would be required for somebody to be accepted into a convent. And we know that people like this have been in religious life, perhaps especially in times when it was like such in the Middle Ages, when it was conventional to send, your second son of a noble family into the priesthood, or whatever other reasons there might be. So I think that she's probably presented as someone who, I don't know about if it's somebody who doesn't belong there, but as somebody who is there not for the right reasons, and also who, to the extent that she takes on some of these like disciplines and self-mortification and stuff, there is a quality to it that just has nothing to do with like religion
right.
at all.
And that's like a little thwarted.
Yeah.
It's for these reasons that I said earlier that, maybe this isn't a film for a catechumen or someone who's a neophyte in the faith, or certainly for young children,
But we get this scene where Thérèse is like, she comes and like makes flowers in the shape of a T on Thérèse's bed, and then is
Sister Lucy
is taking a look at her journal, and Thérèse catches her and she runs away. And then Thérèse immediately starts praying to Jesus, like, you need to do something about her or do something for her, because she's capable of anything and she's gonna cause a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
So she recognizes Saint Thérèse doesn't see Sister Lucy as like of the same chip off the old block of her spirituality, so to speak. So at least the filmmaker gives us that kind of distinction there, if less so with the letter from Celine.
Yeah.
I think what both of you are trying to describe is what I would put as there is I believe a a critique in the film from a secular perspective towards this kind of, or if not a critique, it's at least asking the question, what is religious life for? But it doesn't ever pose that in explicit or even very implicit terms. It has a very extremely subtle way of going about it. The scene for me that best exemplified that, there are two aspects to it. The first is, we've already talked about kind of the eroticism in the film, and one thing that it keeps coming up in the film is through these asides, these kind of theatrical asides of various nuns quoting the Song of Songs.
Yes.
Which I actually found entirely beautiful and appropriate, because I mean,
yes.
like, again, the whole, and this is why I say, like, this, if there is a critique, it's really more like a Rorschach test. I think the film is kind of, the way it's opposing a possible critique is it's really more of a Rorschach test, and like, what do you see in the film?
Yes.
But because to make a film about religious life that extensively quotes the Song of Songs, is entirely understandable, and that
yes.
That's in some ways that's accessing a very deep truth about what the religious life is. The religious life is the fullest manifestation of the life of the soul described in Song of Songs. Like, absolutely, we need to look into that. But then from the world's perspective, you have what seems to be this contradiction between this longing that is interpreted as primarily erotic, versus, of course, the self-denial that is required in religious life. And the scene for me that most exemplifies this dialectic or whatever is the long scene on Christmas night when the nuns are all the sisters are gathered in community, and a carpenter sends a little wooden baby Jesus to them to celebrate Christmas, and they all take turns holding him and caring for him. And you get this scene that I'm actually honestly kind of conflicted about it, because it, on the one hand, it's a beautiful scene, and I'm not 100% sure if there were real nuns in that, because it's a group shot. There's a lot of nuns in there, and I wouldn't be surprised if they even cast real nuns to be part of the extras. I'm not sure if that's the case or not. But anyway, you see this stunning joy and beauty, and just the tenderness, the sweetness, the strangeness of all of these women who have given up earthly motherhood, holding a wooden child like he's their own child, to the Catholic mind, you see that and you go, yes, absolutely. I know exactly what's going on here. This is beautiful. This is devotion. This is accessing a very deep spiritual reality. To the worldly mind, you get this, I mean, it's this very strange, like, how sad is it? You see that these very motherly women are never going to get to hold their own children because they have given it up. And I don't think the film goes to either side, but the fact that something about the way that it kind of lingers on that, it gives me pause,
Right. So I think that you're hitting on what made me kind of uncomfortable was that the filmmaker really does not give you any sort of indication of like which way this film is leaning. Is it leaning more toward a critique, or is it leaning more toward a kind of
celebration?
Celebration, or like a seeking. I think that's why I describe it as kind of stopping at the gates, because I think that if they were to, it doesn't have to be like an effort to celebrate it, right? But just to go into it deeper, to really find like what is the beating heart there. I think you can't help but kind of.
What is it that like you feel is he's holding back?
I mean, I don't know how to.
It didn't occur to me watching it that it could be a critique, that scene.
Well, okay, but like, I think that's why Nathan has described it as kind of like a Rorschach test, because it's like you will see into it what you want to see into it.
What would they have? What would they have done to tip their hand?
I mean, okay, so for instance, right, like the scene with Thérèse reading the letter from her sister. There is nothing given to us anywhere to suggest that that's an immature response or desire.
Yeah.
Nothing from Thérèse, nothing from the filmmaker, no sort of like, I mean, what could they have done? Anything. I don't know, like a shadow could have cast over her face, or like, I don't know, like anything they could have done. It could be a million different ways, subtle or explicit, to suggest a point of view. But like the point of view seems to be kind of deliberately holding back a bit. I think that when you make that move as a filmmaker, you don't stay neutral, that you do end up kind of suggesting something. And
interesting.
And so that's why I'm just a little hesitant,
What if you just want to let people come to their own conclusions?
Yeah, maybe so.
And I think the film is doing that. Sorry, Thomas, if you want to.
No, do it, Nathan.
Well, just the film is very much. I think it is predicated on that. I think it thinks that it's made. I think it's made in a way that is meant to let people come to their own conclusions. But the thing that we haven't really talked about in this particular question is the nature of adaptation itself, which is that there was material that they could have included, which they chose not to, and there was material that they included which has no basis in the prime material of Story of a Soul or the accounts of Saint Therese's life. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think Sister Lucy was a real character, right? And actually, it's funny, in my notes for the film, I put, in the first half while I was watching it, like, that it's a film that doesn't have the need to fictionalize anything. Even a very pious treatment of Saint Thérèse would probably feel the need to try to fictionalize aspects to get through her whole life or get through a major portion, And so one of the things I respect about the film in the early going is just how it doesn't try to do that, but then, as we're saying later on, it does introduce this fictional character. So I think the fact that it introduces a fictional character, even though one who is very plausible, very realistic, given the time and the setting, it's still, that is a conscious choice. That is a choice to introduce a dialectic of some sort that is not just arising. It might be suggested by the subject of the character, of Saint Thérèse and her life, but that is a conscious decision on the part of the filmmaker, even if it's done kind of, very subtly. And it might be a good decision too. I don't want to say outright that it's not, but I think this is part of the slippery nature of the film, is that it is very hands off in certain aspects that other productions would be very hands-on about. This is the meaning, whether that's positive or negative. This is what we want you to take away. This film is one of the things that I think is very laudable about it, is that it doesn't seem to be doing that, and yet at the same time we're having this discussion about whether there is
Yeah.
kind of a subtle critique. There is ultimately, whether that's latent, in the sort of the philosophy of the filmmakers, or whether it was more intentional, it's really hard to say. But there is something there, and that's part of the whole process of really kind of digging it out.
Yeah, you were saying like people could have fictionalized like pious things if they were doing like a more overtly pious treatment. I think that like one reason that it works without doing that is that the performance of Thérèse speaks for itself in this film, and there really would be no need to do any of that. But then when they're dealing with the darker elements, they bring in these other things.
But I think that the thing that we have yet to really talk about is Thérèse stepping on the crucifix in this film. Right, like that. It's kind of a weird moment.
Accidentally.
But then she doesn't really lift her foot.
Yeah, but I think she's pretty like she's trying to shift around.
Thomas,
she's
it's a Rorschach test. You're reading into it. You're seeing what you want to see. But like,
well, what the heck else am I supposed to see?
We see a woman, a saint, stepping on the crucifix and kind of like staying with that.
Yeah.
So I don't know what to make of that. But what do you think, Nathan?
I didn't know what to make of it either. Again, I don't think the film gives really a rationale to, it goes right to the edge of kind of like what is going on here. Like it makes it clear that she's groggy. She's not really aware of what she's doing.
That's what I was saying. Yeah,
that's how I took it. But yeah, like the film is lingering on this particular thing, this particular episode, and
she steps on it, and then it's almost as if she considers it. She like notices that she's stepping on the crucifix, and again, yeah, you're right. She does this at first without realizing it, but then she looks and kind of considers it, and then we even hear the grinding, if I'm not mistaken, of like of it against the ground as her foot kind of shifts and it stays underneath it.
Yeah, so this happened in the context of the scene where Sister Lucy comes to her infirmary room and kind of says goodbye to her, essentially, and Sister Thérèse gets up to greet her. I don't know. But as she gets up from her bed, the crucifix on her pillow falls to the floor. And so, the immediate context is like Sister Lucy, like, causing trouble. She's like in some indirect way, she's also kind of like, she's like an element of like darkness or even like the diabolical. I mean, she's in that scene with the lobster too. She's the one who says it's the devil.
She's laughing as she sees Thérèse handling
it. And so I think there's something of that too. But James brought up that movie Under the Son of Satan. It reminded, some of these elements actually reminded him of that, and some of like the weirder, darker elements based on the Bernanos novel. But this, so she's stepping on this crucifix. My reading of it was that like it's not intentional, but you're right that there is this kind of like strange moment where she's kind of looking down and like she isn't like getting off of it right away, and it's like it's unclear whether she's almost in like a trance like state or something. But it is strange. It is a dark moment, and I'm not sure what they're doing with it. And it's similar to the thing where she's being given her last rites by the priest when she receives communion.
Yeah, maybe so.
So something like that anyway. And she, because of her tuberculosis, she coughs out the host, I think, onto a white sheet that's being held under her. And in those moments, you're like, okay, well, that wasn't intentional on her part, but like it's this weird note to strike, and it's like, would God allow that to happen? Like what's going on here? Why would God allow her to accidentally step on a crucifix? Like, would God allow her to like cough up the Eucharist? I connected the latter at least with like I don't want to use the phrase dark night of the soul because I think that phrase is overused and misunderstood, and like, but like the desolation. Yeah, the desolation. Yeah, the desolation that she's experiencing. I like connected to that with like her just not being able to receive that like consolation, but there is something kind of obviously disquieting to see that in a film, either of those images. And so, Is this some kind of like poison that's being slipped into the film? I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on this, Nathan?
Well, just to deal with the with the communion, I didn't have an issue with that. I mean, it's visceral and it's horrifying. Like it activates all the instinctive response of like seeing something horrible happen at mass. But it's entirely. I don't know if that happened with Saint Thérèse. I don't recall reading that, but it's the aspect of a gravely ill person being unable to swallow the Eucharist. I'm pretty sure that there's precedent for that in the church. That doesn't bother me per se. Whether it's trying to say whether that's symbolizing something else is an open question. Again, this is probably where the film is just so reticent to really kind of go there. Yeah, it's entirely possible that it is, but you're kind of given this freedom to kind of just take it and leave it. Again, it's part of this approach. The film is not dramatizing anything. It's also not really propagandizing anything. It's just giving you all these events, and you're kind of just left to take it or leave it. With the crucifix incident, that one, I don't know what to make of that. I was just rewatching that scene actually as you were talking, and part of the issue is that it's such a brief moment, and this could really be extended as a critique to the film as a whole. It really, the film doesn't really ever develop much in the way of any kind of scene in the sense that, something happens and then something happens in response. And then even just aside from like a dramatic sense, where you're left going away, oh, that's what that means, And I think this is, on the whole, this strategy is a strength of the film, but then it seems in the moments where the film does actually give itself room to expand and kind of marinate. And again, the film of the scene of the nuns with the baby Jesus, I think is a good example of this, where it slows down and it just kind of stops and takes in something. That's when you start to go, I'm not sure what is going on here. The scene with the crucifix never, it ends really before even, it ends quickly enough that you're kind of just going, oh, that was odd,
Yeah.
But if it kept developing that, if it kept kind of emphasizing that, like, this is what's happening, and, then I think that I would have taken that as like, there's something, blasphemous is kind of going on here. Maybe that was the intent. I don't know. It didn't strike me in the moment as that though. It was just, It was an odd thing that kind of ended before it really got going. But I would just say that reflects a lot of the scenes in the film in general, whether they're positive or negative aspects.
I'm not saying that that's what's going on in this movie. It would be awfully odd to like make a movie with such an incredible portrayal of Saint Thérèse, just only to like throw in stuff that's like just kind of like doesn't even have to make sense, but it's effective on its own as an image, just to subvert you,
Yeah.
But like I was thinking about that because there's just like these elements that are kind of inexplicable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a curious film. It's a weird film at times, but it's also an amazingly beautiful film. And like I said, it's one of my favorites that we've watched on this podcast so far.
I think those elements you could even possibly chalk them down to the same thing as Under the Son of Satan, which is like just like a lack of like understanding, like desolation from the inside, and like an over focus on it because von Balthasar commented on Bernanos, who wrote Under the Son of Satan, that he thought the entirety of the mystical life was the dark night of the soul.
Yeah.
So there could be something going on, not that they think that in this movie, but there could be something, sorry to go back to it, but just to put a pin on this, to wrap this up. I think there could be that going on where like there is some idea, some legitimate idea that the filmmaker has that he didn't quite understand how to express or didn't have fleshed out in his head, and so it's like the beginnings of a thought that is not well formed, but neither is it necessarily subversive. It's just like perhaps a misunderstanding of something.
And I think that describes pretty well how I was feeling about this, and trying to describe it as being like outside of the gates, especially around this question of suffering.
Right.
It's like the beginning of a thought, but like not quite there.
Yeah.
Nathan, did you have anything you wanted to add at the end there?
I do, yeah. So, well, this is just something kind of goes back to the film in general. Again, just quickly about adaptation, which is, it's striking that, or I guess in general, I'd say the film really kind of has to be read, as a reaction. It's a reaction to that sentimental, pious kind of artistic culture that was very prevalent in France, probably in that director's childhood, but that's also something that all Catholic cinema has to deal with, or all cinema about Catholic subjects kind of has to deal with that by default. My impression of the film overall is that it's in a vacuum, like a film about Saint Thérèse. This is not the film about her. The film only really makes sense as a response to kind of the opposite, which would be that overly sentimental cliche that is very associated with her story. And so what I would like to see is that, is a film that actually does take on the poetic mantle and the dramatic mantle to really, it's a cliche way of putting it, but really get inside, who Saint Thérèse was. This film doesn't do that. It does an admirable job of showing what it would be like to witness a saint from the outside. And I think this is something that a lot of films, some films and some of the films on the Vatican film list do this very well. Flowers of St. Francis is another example of a film that is really about observing exterior actions without really commenting on what's happening on the interior. And so I think there's a venerable kind of tradition of doing that in modern cinema, but for it to really go somewhere deeper and more, to reach the fullest extent of what cinema is capable of, I think you have to apply the essentially the narrative aspect, which brings in all of the interior, psychological, and spiritual elements. And the striking thing about the best example I would say in that regard that I can think of recently would be A Hidden Life, which is about a saint. And it does so in a way that's very much about observing his life, his exterior life, but it also leaves no doubt whatsoever what the interior struggle was, and such that you are experiencing the interior cross that he is going through. This film doesn't do that with Saint Thérèse.
But the performance does it, I think, more so than A Hidden Life.
Okay, that's incomplete. I don't even know how you would argue that.
I think that you're never going to recapture this performance of Saint Thérèse, even if in a film that takes on the overall formal or aesthetic mantle of this film and gives a more complete treatment.
I would agree with that, but I would hope that a film that does a more full treatment of Saint Thérèse, would find an even greater performance. That would put this one.
Thomas thinks that there can be no greater performance.
I don't see how there's a better performance.
It's a wonderful performance, but I would say it's specific to this film.
Yeah, I won't take things off the table.
It's interesting that you mentioned A Hidden Life, because a number of secular critics said they came away from the movie not really understanding what was motivating.
That's true.
Blessed Franz.
Well,
but there's so much more external conflict and so many more matters of conscience to deal with that you can still understand the issues in a way. All you have in this movie is what you have is the presence of Saint Thérèse speaking for itself rather than any of that other stuff.
And the extraordinary thing, again, I mentioned adaptation. I didn't really go into that. This is my last. I have two more comments, but I can save the last one for the wrap up.
Dude, I think you're gonna have to lay both these comments out because we're
this was the wrap up.
This is the wrap up.
This is okay. Well, you asked the question about what is Saint Cinema, right?
Yeah,
I think I thought we were going to talk.
And frankly, you're doing a really good job of giving us a bearing for.
I thought you were doing that already.
Yeah.
Okay.
So just keep doing what you're doing, man.
Anyway, with regards to adaptation, the thing about Saint Thérèse compared to virtually the entire roster of the saints in the churches in the calendar is that we have her entire story from her own lips, from her own pen, with the fullness of like modern psychological
word.
depth, and
Word.
like it's like this is almost an unheard of in the entire tradition of the church. Really, it's her and Augustine and Saint Teresa. Maybe like there's a handful of other saints you could say this of, right? They're all heavy hitters. But the thing is, the vast majority of saints, we don't have this, and so it's striking to me that one of the few saints where we have this complete like prime material to work on and to tell a narrative from. This film makes the elective decision to basically do away with all that, as though it doesn't exist. We have no interior that, you know, and I find that extraordinary. And I think that's partly a response again to the culture, the cliches, the culture, all that excess that's kind of risen.
But her
up,
personality is very well
around
conveyed,
her.
I think. And perhaps
Absolutely,
that's something that they're able to get from that.
I think they're trying to get to
material
that
she wrote herself that you couldn't get with Saint, Saint. I can't come up with an example. I was just about to make
Saint
up a
Saint
name.
Battle of
Felicity.
Hastings, Edward the Confessor. You know, we're never going to know what Edward the Confessor what was going through his head when he got killed on the field. But it's just striking. I don't know. I don't really have an opinion on this. I'm just saying like it's just striking to me like that this is where things are at with this film. You know. And I think I would say ultimately, I think it is, I guess I do have an opinion on it. I guess ultimately I would say that it doesn't help the film. And I think this is the limitation of this particular approach. They're saying we're going to approach, and I just want to quote one very quick thing from Andre Bazin, because it wouldn't be this podcast.
Be a Nathan guest host
but
segment.
I swear I wasn't planning to do this, but I was reading this just before we started, and he wrote about a film, actually timely because we're recording this right around Saint Maria Goretti's feast. He made a review on a film about Saint Maria Goretti from the 50s, an Italian film called Heaven Over the Marshes. I don't believe it's available anymore.
So just while you're looking for that, what you're saying is that the film's, what I refer to as like the integrity of this film's cinematic approach, does not actually serve the material, or at least it does not serve like what the material is lacking in the film, even if it might serve what is present. Doesn't allow it to get beyond what
it hits a wall. I think it hits a wall. I think the approach hits
that's
a wall.
Good way of putting
treating
it.
the thing about
one might say.
The thing about cinema as an art of the real, it's about what does it do well? It records things happening. It records gestures, express again, physical reality, right? But to evoke spiritual reality, you have to do something more, right? And I mean, this is part of the gambit that the director has set up intentionally for himself. He's like, he's not going to deal with the spiritual. He's only going to deal purely with the physical gestures, movements, expressions, performance. But really, I think, you can only go so far with that. In his review of this film about Saint Maria Goretti, Andre Bazin writes, the film is essentially saying, this is Maria Goretti, watch her live and die. On the other hand, she is a saint. Let those who have eyes to see read by transparence the evidence of grace in her life, just as you must do at every moment in the events of your own lives. And so I think this gets at really gets at the heart of the challenge of like making a film about a saint, which is that in reality, like in our lives around us, no one is walking around with a canonization, and to tell a film about a person's life, there is nothing to indicate. Well, there may be extraordinary events, miracles, and things like that. We have, that's something that has to obviously be considered on a case by case basis. But really, if we look at saints like Saint Thérèse, who, as far as I'm aware, she wasn't like a walking miracle manifester like other saints are. Everything that we know about her saintliness really comes from Story of a Soul and from realizing, oh, this is what was going on. Like when the sisters finally read her diary and they're like, oh, we knew she was holy, but this is what was going on. It's not like they didn't know she was a saint. She was a saint. But there was no halo. There was no, it's like ultimately it's an act of faith. Like ultimately you have to treat it like the works, the acts of God in your life, in front of you, where it requires an act of faith. And a cinema that approaches it in that way, at least what Bazin is arguing, and I would agree with him, is like that the most honest way of approaching this is to treat the story of a saint in this manner, where you you have to let the transparency of grace really, it's something that you have to accept kind of on faith. And I think that's something that A Hidden Life does do well. There's a whole other argument for that. I think there's aspects of that in Thérèse. I think the strengths of the film is that it leaves room for that. And the beauty of the performance is a particular vehicle of that. But as a whole, the film is kind of so opposed to, well, I won't go there anyway. As a whole, it's not, no, anyway, I'm losing it. Basically, the ordinariness, like if we really want to look into like a film that captures the ordinariness of experience, of reality, and then applies that to a saint, it's the best films about saints are going to be the ones that accept that aspect of like the mundanity, the ordinary, but also they can't shy away from what really happened to that saint, you know? So that's the thing. I think, we can't say that you have to like remove miracles and things that are associated as part of an actual saint's story. You have to accept all of it. Right. But the fact is, for the majority of saints, like it's going to be
majority
pretty,
of the time. Of any saint, is going to be filled with mundane life experiences.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, our Lord was in A Hidden Life for 30 years.
Yeah. No voiceover.
And so I would say, like, until we as a church and as filmmakers and artists and anyone involved with the dramatic arts in the church, like really kind of embrace that aspect of the hidden life of our Lord, as kind of the driving engine of how we approach arts of the real, and especially lives of saints. I think we're just going to keep we're going to keep doing that cycle of where we end up with like plaster saint type sentimentality, and then the reaction to that, which a film like Thérèse is kind of part of, where it's taking things way back on the other side, getting away from sentimentality and getting over into kind of this abstract modern
brutalist.
Brutalist.
Brechtian. Well, I keep wanting to say Brechtian. I keep waiting for you to pick up on that, James, because you're the theater guy. But
no, I dig it. I dig it. I wouldn't necessarily describe this film as Brechtian, but there's certainly elements of it.
But Pasolini, this ain't. I'll say that for it. Like, if you're going to talk about like modern abstract, like this film has a lot more like human feeling in it than Pasolini.
There's one more thing I want to say. I guess we're very much at the end. So, and this is for me. Rewatching this, I was struck by something that has struck me by a lot of films that deal with religious character. I mean sisters and brothers, in particular. And I think this is maybe one of the single biggest issues with the way the modern West tackles saint stories, which is that the role of the Eucharist is completely non-existent. Yeah. And I find this, it's not only, and you can see this also in A Hidden Life. You can see this in Thérèse. Yes. You can see this in just about any film in the last 60 years or even longer made about a Catholic saint. The Eucharist,
see personal prayers by the bedside. You almost never see much ritual. That,
or you see, as we see in this film, she's praying before an image of the Sacred Heart, or of our Lord in the Sacred Heart. But it's like she lives in a convent. She has a chapel. Like, she would have been in adoration every day. Yeah. Anyone who's living a normal Catholic life, like, knows what it's like just to pop into the church or whatever, like, even if it's only like once a week or once, whatever, like the aspect of the Eucharistic devotion is completely missing from most cinematic depictions of saints. And this to me is the single biggest tell of like what is really going on here. What is this really about? Because when religious devotion is depicted, it's with highly symbolized images, like something like the Sacred Heart or images of Our Lady or whatever. But it's not meant to really bring you into that moment of devotion or even to understand their devotion. It's really just to say, like, this person is devoted. It's operating with their faith on us. It's symbolizing their faith. And so that to me is the biggest kind of flaw with this kind of approach is the embodied, the lived reality of our faith in the Eucharist is completely missing. And any story of a saint that doesn't have that is missing something absolutely critical about that saint. As moving as it is to see all the other aspects, all the other virtues, all the other good things that are part of that story.
Yeah.
This to me always stands out, and I just can't really get
We
over
talked
it,
about that
you
a
know?
lot with A Hidden Life, not so much about about going to mass, about his personal devotions.
We
things
didn't
like that.
cover that on
Yeah.
this podcast. This was our first film discussion over on the Catholic Culture podcast.
Yeah.
Perhaps someday
I'll
it'll
probably
end up in our
publish
feed.
it in this feed sometime.
Yeah, when we need a stopgap.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
Thanks Nathan for all of that. I think that was all very well put, and
Yeah.
it certainly gives us a lot to think about going into the many other saint films that are on the Vatican film list. You know, we've already mentioned Flowers of St. Francis, but there's St. Joan of Arc, there's St. Vincent de Paul, probably one or two others that I'm not thinking of, but yeah, I'm glad that with this film, with Thérèse, we really got into this. For those of you who have stuck it out with us right to the end here, thank you for listening, for watching. Thank you, Nathan, for joining the show again. Always a pleasure.
Guys.
Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, whatever, the dingaloo. I don't know what the platforms are asking you to do these days. Just do it to follow us.
Yeah.
And if you want to help us out producing this podcast and the other podcasts in the Catholic Culture Podcast Network, head over to catholicculture.org/donate.
/audio.
Oh, yeah, that's right. /donate/audio. We'll earmark your donation specifically for this show and our other audio offerings, and we'll be very grateful. We'll pray for you extra